So hello and welcome to my new tutorial. This time we're going to take our spaceship that we designed in the last tutorial and we're going to try to make it pretty. So first of all, we need to go into Modo and kind of decide on the kind of graphic layout of our materials. So we need to tell Octane that certain parts of the model have different kinds of textures, so that we later can assign. Later we can just play with our materials, and they're already assigned to the right pieces. So of course the overall color of my ship has a certain texture, and the engines have a different one, and there are certain other graphical elements that I want to be different. So Octane doesn't know that by itself, so I need to go into whatever modeling application you're using, in this case Modo, and select the different objects, or select the different polygons, and give it a selection. So at the same time that I do this, I can also just give it different colors, so I can see the graphic layout of how the ship will look like later. That does not mean that I want the ship to be green. I just chose a color that is very distinctive, and I can see how it is different from the other colors in the ship, so I can judge if the graphical layout will work. So I just chose green. Why not? Doesn't matter. I could have made it yellow or blue or pink. The kind of selections, definitions you make here have no bearing on what it will look like in Octane. So now I go around and select different faces, different polygons, different objects, and assign certain materials. In Modo you do that by selecting the object or face and pressing M, and then you can give it a name and choose a color. The names you should take care of so that you actually know what it is later. Those names will pop up in Octane, so that don't name it material 1, 2, 3. Give it proper names, like, I don't know, I use like metal or body or chassis or whatever you want to use. That's really up to you, just so you can find it later and you know kind of what it's for. So if I want something shiny, I'll call it shiny, or I mean, you can use whatever names you think are appropriate and that you know what you're actually dealing with. Another thing I also do is that once I do my selections, I also see if I need to make any alterations for the model itself. Maybe I'll realize that, okay, I made certain modeling choices before, but once I actually give it a color, it kind of looks a tad different than what I intended it to be. Of course, you can also do this process at the same time that you model. So maybe that's even like a better way to go about it, that you assign your materials just at the same time that you do the modeling, so you can actually make your design choices and your decisions in real time. So here I'm trying out different kind of patterns, different kind of material breakups, because of course I don't want the ship to be so uniform in color. So I kind of choose my graphic layout to introduce secondary shapes, break up the bigger shapes, because you see, even though that I chose certain shapes here that might break up the geometry of the object and bisect like a very flat looking plane. Once I make it in a certain color, it becomes quite uniform and becomes one shape again. So I need to go back and work with the colors here and the materials to break up those shapes, to not have them look too uniform. So here I have basically one main color for the body. I have another color for anything that's in a crevice inside, that is maybe like something darker, a machine part, something underneath the skin of the ship, so to speak. I also chose like a secondary color, which in this case is like a grayish white tone, I also have a accent color, which I chose red. So you just saw that. Now I'm just trying to select all the faces inside here. So yeah, I have an accent color, which is kind of like a reddish tone. Maybe I want to change that to yellow later or something that indicates functionality, that gives it like a bit more like a saturated kind of accent color here and there, that can help to break up the overall monotony of the all over shape, and can provide little points of saturation, little points of where I want to direct the eye. It also helps me to maybe imbue some sort of indication of what this part could be for in terms of functionality. Now, I'll be probably going back and forth between Octane and Modo to change my graphic layout in certain ways. I cannot foresee all the different kinds of problems that I will have in Octane. Of course, maybe you would say that using a plugin like the Octane plugin actually in Modo would be more useful in that case. But I find it more useful to use the Octane Standalone, as it has a few more features and it's a bit more powerful. Actually, it's a bit faster than the plugin in Modo, but that is certainly a personal preference. So I do not mind going back and forth a bit between this and the standalone. So now I'll make my choices here. Maybe select some edge loops. There's some overlapping areas, but I'll just try to select it as good as possible. There's a certain amount of, giving it a bit of functionality, but also, most of all, it's about what are good proportions, what looks good, because of course that plays a big role. So here you see that accent color, that red accent color that I want to have in there. Not too big. And of course, what I need to do is also choose my light sources. So I want to have certain areas lit up that will illuminate my ship here and there. So I just name it light for now. I'm going to put an emissive material in Octane there later. So I'll just put it as complete white, so I know that it's supposed to be the lights. And I place them often, they should be very small to kind of feed into the idea that this is a very large ship, and a large ship is not going to have huge amounts of big lights, but it's going to have tiny lights everywhere around the ship to illuminate the surfaces. It's going to be very nice to actually play with the surface imperfections and reflectivity once we have done our materials. So it's going to be quite a nice compounding effect. So you see I'm doing some selections here and then get rid of it again, because not everything is working as I want it to work. Not everything looks good, but I need to try. I can always go back and reverse my choices. Add some more lights here and there. So you might see the graphic layout change over time. I have not always recorded that process because it's always the same kind of process I do. I just change the graphic layout slightly and reload the object into my Octane setup. So here I'm trying to maybe make some choices in terms of changing the geometry to get a nicer graphical layout. And I will just continue this process for the entire ship until every piece has a material assigned and a graphic layout. So one thing I need to quickly do is select all the subdivision surfaces and freeze them. So because Octane cannot display that, so I do that by selecting it, going to geometry, say freeze, and say OK. And now you can see that it's a polygon surface, but it retains that kind of shape. Okay, so now let's go into Octane. Before we get into the material definition and setting up our ship, I just want to give you a bit of an overview over the Octane Standalone version, just to quick rundown of the main functions I'm using. There's an overwhelming amount of information here presented, but we of course don't need everything, just a few main items to get started. So in terms of the interface, once you open it up, you have kind of like an outliner here where you can see all the items in your scene. You have the database of materials, the one that's connected to the internet, and also one that you can store locally. You have the render viewport. We don't have anything here yet. Neither do we have anything in the node graph editor. So here we're going to do all our work actually, and here we're going to see what we're working on in real time. The node inspector gives us all sorts of settings, sometimes specific to the task we're working on, or also everything at once, depending on what we want. So to get started in Octane, the first thing you need to do is go to the node graph editor and do a right click. And then the first item we need is a render target. So once you press here, we can see something is there. Nothing is displayed yet because we actually haven't selected any geometry yet. We haven't loaded anything, no materials, nothing. What we do have, however, is a variety of inputs here. If you hover over them, you can see what they are. So you have the camera, environment, and all sorts of things. By standard, you have a few basic parameters set already. So you have sensor width, focal length for the camera, you have like viewing angle, depth of field, all sorts of stuff, environment you have here. These are all pertaining to camera here. You see camera, you can minimize or maximize this. Environment, you have texture environment, you also have planetary and daylight environments that have different options, and then render settings, kernel, where you can set if you want to have direct lighting, PMC or path tracing, which we'll get into a bit later. You have basically just direct lighting is very good for previewing your stuff, and then once you want to move to like a more final render, you can use PMC or path tracing. They have different advantages and disadvantages. Usually the golden rule for now is that direct lighting is faster, and the other two are they take a bit longer to render, but they will look better. Sometimes more, sometimes less. So you have all these things, but at the same time, we can also have, for example, we can add a different camera in here. So this is called usually a thin lens camera, so usually the standard one, and then you can plug that in, and then you can save all your settings here. So let's say this is 50mm, but then you can also Command C, Command V, copy paste. You can have a different camera, and then you can change that to 85mm. So now you have two different camera setups that have different parameters, and you can store your camera position, your depth of field, all these things you can save here. But for now, we don't need those. So the first thing we need to do is actually get our geometry in. And we do that by always right-clicking and getting this menu here. So we want geometry, and we want to have a mesh. the other thing you can do is go here and then drag and drop it in. So we'll just use the one that we built here. I'd recommend you to use FBX or OBJ files. So now we have the geometry and we have the render target, but they're not connected yet, so nothing will be displayed. So we can take this one, the geometry output, and put that into the geometry input of the render target. So you see something happened and it's calculating a bit slower. We need to actually find the object, so usually it's very much zoomed in, so we just need to zoom out quite a fair bit before we can see it. Or not. Oh, that is because our camera has been deleted when we deleted the node. Without a camera, we can't see anything. So now we can zoom out. And here you see something is coming. And here we have our ship. Now with the left mouse button you can rotate. With the right mouse button you pan. And with the wheel you zoom. That's pretty much all we need. So now we have our object here. It has no materials, of course, but you can see it has all these inputs here, which I defined earlier in the pattern in Modo, and all the names, of course, it has as well. So right now we can't do much with it. If you, for example, have multiple objects, and you can do that easily by you can drag and drop in a different FBX, a different OBJ, or you can copy and paste this one here. So now we have two, but we can't see anything yet, right? So in order to display multiple objects, we right click, say geometry group, and here we have two. So I can plug these in. So now I have two objects, but I don't see anything because they occupy the same place in space. In order to be able to move them around, I need another node called the placement node. So I can plug that here in. And then I need to activate the move, rotate, or scale tool. And then I can move this object, and I have two. So of course I can make this one bigger uniformly or in one axis, whatever I prefer. So my camera is on auto focus at the moment. So by using this eyedropper tool that says AF, I can click on an object and have everything in focus. On the other hand, I can also go to my render target, go to camera, and set the f-stop to something ridiculous like 64, and everything will always be sharp. It's worth getting a bit into the camera tools on your own. It pretty much behaves like a real camera with the f-stop, focal length, depth of field, so I'd recommend you learn a bit about that, but it's probably part of another tutorial. So now we have that. If you want to add more objects, you just click on the geometry group and say add input, and we have one more. So much for that. We can also go to the environment. So as I said before, this node inspector can show everything at once, or you can also go to specific areas. So we have the render target here, and all of these buttons here on the side, they pretty much pertain to specific parts of the render target. So if you only want to talk about cameras, then you can isolate the settings here, or we can go to the environment. Maybe you don't want to have texture, maybe you want to have daylight. So now we have a simulated daylight environment where we can change, for example, things like the time. So you see it's 10 o'clock in the morning by default, and then we can go to something like early morning. You will see the sun in the distance, or we can go to sunset. So here we have the sun as well. There's no ground plane, so it looks a bit weird. It works best for really the daylight, because at night it becomes a bit strange once the sun is below the horizon. So we have power. We have power, of course, where you can increase or decrease the power. Can sometimes be useful. I also use the north offset. So let's say we have the sun like this, but with the north offset you can basically rotate and dial exactly in what kind of shadows and where the light is supposed to hit. It keeps the time and the sun position, but the sun angle, but it just rotates it around on a platter basically. We can also change sky color and sunset color. You can change the sun disk size. So in case you say like, oh, the sun is really too small for me, I want to have a really big sun. You see, you can really make it big for great sunset shots and all sorts of stuff. Other areas that I usually use, and I mean there's a lot of stuff here, but I honestly don't use most of these. We can, for example, use the resolution. So here we set the resolution. There's a couple of presets like 1080p, 4K, whatever you want to use, square, post on Instagram or whatever. So that's the final output. Once you start rendering in here, let's say you set it to this and then you want to save it, you can save it here. Saves the current render to disk. And you can choose the format. Another area which is very important is the render pass. So let's say we not only want to have the beauty pass, but we also want to have something, for example, the Z depth or the material ID. So you get material ID, check. So you get these little buttons on the bottom here. And now we can say, for example, I want to have the Z depth pass. You can adjust the Z depth pass by using that slider here. And you see, once you hit the right range, you can set it so that you can add it later to your scene and get maybe something you can separate the objects by distance better. Or you can have the material ID. Right now everything has the same material applied. Once we check all these materials in here, once we plug them in, then you will see that the different materials will appear, and that will help us to make quick selections in Photoshop. Another thing I use is, for example, the imager, where you can play with exposure and other camera related effects, and of course also the post-processing. Once you click that, you see that you can have stuff like these glares, more or less of them. You can blur the glare, so if you don't want to have these like J.J. Abrams style light flares in here. You can also increase the bloom. This is a very popular tool and also can be easily overused, but it can sometimes give you more of a photographic look to your images. So that is it pretty much for these settings here. That's the ones I used most often. So we will get into the shader creation in a different video, of course. This is just the basic one to show you. But going up this line, the other thing we will need is, of course, a material. So we'll ignore most of this. We'll just go here to the material and we can choose whatever we want to use here. There's diffuse, glossy, metallic. They do pretty much what you think they would. Diffuse gives you like a very non-reflective material. Glossy is more shiny. Metallic has special parameters for emulating particular kind of metals. Specular is for anything glass related. And universal kind of is a new material that came, I think, with Octane 4, and you can kind of combine lots of different ones together. You have pretty much every selector, every kind of parameter to play with, and that's the one I use these days most often. It has a huge variety of inputs, but of course we only need the ones that will help us to create some funky materials. So you use the output and go into whatever you wanted to define at that point. So we can have where's our body? Our body is here. So you immediately see that something is happening. Of course, it only happens for this ship because this is this one here. But the powerful thing with nodes is now that I do not need to make another one for this ship, but I can just plug it in here as well. So now I'm working on both at the same time. I can disable the move tool. I don't need it right now. And then the only other thing that I really need to show here is that how do we plug in our textures? And for that, we just go to textures and then choose an image. There's many other things you can play with, some of which I will touch on during the actual tutorial. But for now, we just want to load an image. You go to your textures folder and you plug in whatever you want. Let's plug in something. That one here, again, it doesn't show up. You need to plug it in first. And we want to plug it into the diffuse channel, or also called albedo. So that's kind of the ground material. It looks super messy right now. It uses whatever UV map that was established in Modo, but of course we never took care of that. So we actually wanted to tell it to ignore the UV map that is automatically generated by Modo. And we want to tell it to use projection box. So it's just going to use like a box projection. And now you see you have applied. It's applied in a box projection mode, and we can also tell it to use world space. So ignore whatever scale that was for the different elements set, and just use the world coordinates to project this on here. And then we can actually have here R is for rotation, S is for scale, T is for transform. This one is locked right now into a uniform scale. That usually makes sense unless you're going for some very funky effects, and then you can disconnect it. But so now when we move one, we move all of them. And then you can see how now we're setting a different kind of scale for our object. So now, of course, it doesn't make much sense because there's different kinds of things plugged in or there's no images yet plugged in for the specularity and for the roughness and all the other settings. So it looks a bit strange to have this rust texture with like a uniformly glossy surface. But of course, you can do things like take this and plug it into a different channel, so you see how it immediately changes. And we'll get into that later on. So that's really the basic stuff on how to get started with Octane. And we'll get into more detail in the next couple of videos, but this is kind of the basic thing. And of course, again, you save. You can save your project here. These you can pretty much all ignore for now, the ones I haven't touched on yet. Maybe we can now see that the material ID is different now. So now we plugged in something into the body, and you can see how it differentiates itself from the rest of these. And once we plug in everything here into all the material slots, you will see the entire graphic pattern emerge. And then you can save it here as a file, and then we can overlay it in Photoshop and make our quick selections based on that. So yeah, that's it, I think, for the basic Octane functionality. So we'll get on building our spaceship now. Okay, so now let's have a look at texturing in Octane. So I'm gonna drop in my geometry file, and you can see all the inputs like you already saw in the last video. I want to set my render target so I can actually see something. And I plug in my geometry, zoom out to actually see my ship. And there it is. can rotate it by clicking the left mouse button. Okay, that looks good. Just want to make sure from all angles that everything looks okay, just like I intended it during the modeling process. So now I also want to just quickly set up my environment. For that I just do like an extra node called the planetary environment, which will help me to play around with the shots I'm doing for this tutorial, which will be all in space. So for the planetary environment, I can actually change one of the main parameters, which is the altitude. So I can set the value to something like 100,000 or 1,000,000, and you will see how much the object will be lifted up from the planet's surface. I'm going to save that. So now you can see you have a planet down there. I'm just going to use a very basic thing for now and going to play around with the environment later. I want to first get into the ship itself. So I'm going to start with the body, since that makes up the bulk of my ship. And I'm going to do a fair amount of experimentation to see whatever looks best. I have somewhat of an idea of what I want to do, but I want to keep an open mind and also maybe consider ideas that I haven't really thought about before. So here I can see I've selected a few references, a few textures before, the ones I want to play with. So I'm going to choose one of them and plug it into the albedo or diffuse channel. And so I can see how that currently looks like. As I also mentioned before, I'm going to use the box projection, plug it in, and now uniformly scale it up. So I like this material. It's kind of like a bit dirty. It has some kind of graphic design on it. Of course, now it looks badly repeated, so I want to probably change that later on. But I want to throw in some textures, mix them up, see what comes out of it, try out some different ones. Maybe also try some that might not necessarily immediately look like something super useful, but that can be maybe give us some happy accidents and some new ideas that we haven't thought of before. And I always like to play with it and then always see my design from all angles to see what kind of ideas I could get of us. See if like rotating it by 90 degrees will have any effect. You can also plug it into a different channel. The main ones I always use are the very basic ones like specularity or roughness. Controlling how strong the highlights are, how strong the reflectivity is. Also like to play with the inversion, so you can invert it, use the opposite in terms of values. See if you maybe should plug in like just a basic color into the ship and then use our textures more in terms of the additional channels. Maybe a tad too shiny. So you have a lot of inputs here for the universal material, so we have a lot of options to consider. It's also very easy as if you copy paste, Control C, Control V, so we quickly get another set of nodes, the same settings, and then we can go and alter them. You can change the scale of it. Just a quick thing to really allow us to work a lot faster. You can also play with the power of a texture, make it stronger or weaker. I really keep on coming back to that one. I'm wondering if you can really do something with that, even though it looks quite repetitive and weird at the moment, but it gives us a very nice graphic breakup. You can also play with the projection, although box projection is really probably the most useful one. But anyway, we should be open to happy accidents. And just to try out if maybe something interesting comes along. That one looks pretty interesting. Triplanar requires additional sets of nodes. Don't need to get into that right now. With gamma you can change the intensity. So usually a gamma of 2.2 is usually considered normal here in Octane. Changing that value can also result in some interesting effects. A higher value will make it a lot darker, a lot more contrasty. You can of course also invert it. Maybe you want to have a bluish ship. Try something different. Not to use the characters per se, but to use the graphic layout of the characters to achieve some kind of pattern breakup. So that is actually quite interesting, but maybe it's a bit too dark, a bit too black and white. And we might want to consider a more eye-popping color. Even that is fairly interesting. But it's maybe not good as a texture, as it has quite a bit of shading information, and it looks too real in that sense, so it's not necessarily a good graphic texture. So after some more playing around, I found this very nice texture of the underside of an airplane, which can be very useful in giving us all these little details and give us more of a manufactured kind of look. So now I've also used the color correction node. I brought it in. I'm going to use it in a bit, which will help us to actually make changes to our image without really having to load it into Photoshop. So now I want to actually mix it with a different material. So you can see with the color correction we get additional ways of manipulating our JPEG image or the texture with like additional gamma, saturation, hue, brightness and contrast options, which is good, so we don't need to go back into Photoshop, adjust it and bring it back into Octane, and we can also be more flexible trying to use the image unchanged or with the color correction and plug it into different nodes. So now I just created a mix material, so we can actually mix two materials together into one slot and create some kind of more complex material. And in addition, we can also tell Octane how to mix the material by plugging another image texture into the first slot of the mix material. I'll copy paste that just out of convenience and plug in a different image. So now you can see I have kind of achieved a mix between that initial yellow image with the logo on it and the texture with all these little dots and mechanical surface details. When trying to come up with some more unique materials and something custom for your ship, which you definitely should do for at least the main materials, then I think it's always fun to experiment a lot around with it. So now I'm trying to see if we can achieve something with the color correction to get a more saturated color. Because I do want something more eye-popping. Especially I want to create some contrast between the surface of the bluish surface of the Earth or whatever planet is down there and the ship itself, so we have a good color contrast between those two. So you can see now I've actually taken the image out of the albedo slot of the second material and want to use that image as a way to mix the two textures together. So I actually get a subtle mix of these two based on that logo. That gives me like a graphical breakup. So I have a mix between those holes from the other texture and a graphical breakup from that yellow texture. What I want to achieve is at the end that the texture does not look repeated, does not look like it's tiled, but looks like a custom paint job on all parts of the ship without actually having to do any UVs or having to go in at every corner of the ship and have to be careful about the placement of everything. So I want to figure out some kind of custom solution to have everything, but in a sense like procedural. Now I'm trying to get some details. I can add additional layers of details with trying to add these textures into the specularity or roughness slot, so that when the ship is in certain angles and the light hits it in certain ways, I can have additional layers of details. Like in this case, you see this ribbing, this tiling, to indicate lots and lots of details. So now that we use that graphical texture to mix our two textures, you can see that it will only appear where the whiter parts of that logo actually are. So you see those darker areas are only where the logo is. I can change the hue of it to achieve a different kind of color. I copy pasted that because I want to get a different scaling on that texture. So for that I need to duplicate it, and now I can have a different kind of scaling for the texture. So now I can actually take the same texture again, but scale it differently, and it gives me an additional layer of complexity, and actually it kind of destroys the previous very clear logo that was on there, and looks a bit more unique, a bit different, not like a regular tiled photo. Can play with the color correction. The color correction in that sense is great because it will not touch the original image. So if I choose to plug in the original image somewhere else, I can do that as well by just bypassing the color correction, plugging it directly into a different slot. Often this is worth plugging it into different outlets, into different inputs, I mean, to see just what happens. So I'm reaching quite a nice mix with that texture, where it doesn't look repeated, it looks interesting. It gives the ship kind of the vibe I want, which is kind of maybe like a used freighter, or kind of dirtied up ship out of some kind of metal. The only thing that's a bit distracting right now is that the contrast between the black parts and the more orangey parts is just a bit too strong. So I will need to take care of that later on by reducing that contrast. But for now, I'd like to experiment a bit more to see what kind of possibilities we can come up with for a very interesting custom paint job. And sometimes you just need to find, with all those sliders and configurations, you kind of need to figure out how to do certain things, because so many things influence the final look of it and how everything is mixed. So for some reason there has been quite an interesting purple color has introduced itself, which is quite nice. I'm trying to see if the inversion does anything, or any of the other color correction features. But it's just really about experimentation, about trying different things. If I would have tried to paint something on this directly, I would have never come up with something like that. Even if some of it, of course, doesn't work. Like, I don't think the purplish, bluish thing on top kind of works. But nevertheless, it's a very interesting combination that makes for a very unique looking ship. And also in terms of the kind of graphical layout, I would have never thought about that if I've done that any other way. The real-time feedback here is really helpful, so I can see how the texture and everything scales and exactly where the perfect point of the mix is. If I would have to wait every time for the image to re-render, of course I would take way too long and I would never be able to consider all these possibilities. So I think I'm quite happy with the all over grunge look. I like the orange, which is probably the color I'm going to end up with. But I'm just not too sure about, again, the dark areas. So I need to try to find a way to get rid of that. I like these yellowish patches on there. It's very interesting, of these smaller logos. I think the highlights also work quite well. Easiest way to find out how to solve these issues is by plugging it in, plugging it out, see how that affects the overall result. That changed things quite a bit. Nevertheless interesting, even though it's not necessarily that useful. You can see how sometimes the underlying structure, the structural surface quality with all these little parcels and the rectangular kind of divisions that kind of can give us an idea of like slight greebles or like metallic kind of uneven surface, and how it's mixed with the all over paint job can be quite interesting. Let's try something more funky. I have this reptile skin. See if that works, because why not? That's an additional layer of some kind of structural reinforcement excuse me, that can again give us a quality of like some kind of metal, some kind of small sheets of metal repeated all over the ship. That is more a quality of the material, and then we consider the paint job something extra that is on top of everything, like it would be in real life. There would be the metalness of an object, how what kind of material it is, and then you paint on top, and you should kind of maybe think about your ship the same way, or the kind of vehicle you do. So now we're getting quite some interesting reflections and details regarding depending on how the sun reflects the ship. Our shader setup is still very, very simple compared to probably what you've seen from some other guys. But that's usually the area I want to try and hit, that with the most minimal effort I can get the best result in the time given. Now we can actually, with the hue slider, we can change the accent color here, whether we want to have it yellow or reddish or green. We can still change the size of it. So we have still control over all aspects of this texture, which is really great. Everything is non-destructive. Probably can also plug some of these into the bump map channels later on to get additional kind of surface details and surface imperfections. So now we kind of have an all-over idea of where we want to go. Now we need to dial in the finer nuances and details of this. I'm still overall not quite happy with the graphic quality of it, but we can fix that later. It's also important to fix the all-over tone and the material of this ship. Let's plug in, since we're kind of, or at least I felt a bit stuck in regards to that. So let's plug in some of the other materials. For that, we can always go back to the live database to get some more standard materials and modify those, which is always a great way to get some materials on quickly, and that also have some standard configurations like aluminum or any kind of other chrome and steel. But that also allow us to learn a little bit about the way of how shaders are set up in Octane by kind of re-engineering them to also see what works, what doesn't work. So now I want to populate all the other slots of my machinery here with like the standard materials, and then change those. So one is for something like metal, and others are like for something like glass. So I can choose those according to the categories that we have here. So by taking those and changing some of the parameters, like the roughness in this case here and the color, I can quickly get those done because they are not as important as the main material. So I can go about it a bit more, a bit quicker, and can fall back to some standard stuff. My accent color here. So that will help me to just like get my mind off the main structure and help me to see how the all over paint job compares to all the other materials that are on the ship. Get like a glass shader. It's only for the tiny cockpit in front. It's not as important, but so I'm just quickly building the emissive shader. I'm going to use the universal material, and then I'm going to go to emission, and can plug in a black body emission. And you can already see there's some kind of glow happening, and we can crank that up or crank it down depending on how strong we want to have it. But you're already going to see that the rendering of it will take quite a bit longer than without it. So now to test it, I want to turn down the power of my environment, so I can better see how the lights behave. You can see in the back that looks quite nice. That's a good way to test it. Turn the power down of your environment and then crank up your lights and see how that really behaves. So we're still missing the kind of secondary breakup color here. That's still very grayish. So I'll need to find a solution for that. Let's see if we have something more funky for that particular material. The miscellaneous category in Octane and the Octane database has some really funky stuff that I guess doesn't really fit into necessarily straightforward category, but can nevertheless be quite interesting. Sometimes you have to pull these apart to understand how they're built, and sometimes they're very, very complex materials. But again, it's good to understand how these are put together. Maybe somebody knows how to do this quicker. Maybe there's like an organization button which I haven't found yet. So if you know how to do that, please let me know. All I really want to get down to with this one is that I can control the scaling of it with one slider in box projection. I probably might not even end up using this, but you know. So I can just plug this one into all the images and control them all at the same time. But it doesn't really look as good as I hoped it would. So I'm trying to see if maybe it's possible to have the entire ship maybe more grayish and use the secondary color as an additional accent color. But, you know, I decide against it. But, I mean, sometimes you have to try it to see that it doesn't work, and then we'll move on. In the end, we didn't really waste that much time. It could have very well turned out very nicely, but it not always does. Maybe it's good to see for you guys that you understand that not everything we do is always a step forward towards the end result, but also we take steps sideways or step backwards, but we just need to keep on working towards eliminating all the possible solutions that are wrong to arrive at a solution that is, well, in that sense, correct. So I think I decided to build my own again. Still trying to see if that way of doing the layout like this is going to be useful at all. Again, going back to my favorite image here, scaling it up and down, see if that has any use at all. I'll bring back some of that yellow through the saturation slider here. I'm trying to change the hue. Maybe yellow is too strong. Maybe something more orangey is better. Again, trying different things here. Now I'll kind of go back a bit to the original idea I had of, not idea, but the original breakup I had of very uniform color with a grayish accent, or maybe something orangey. I kind of like that yellowish orange color. There is something about this breakup, about the shapes that are really quite nice. It's only that the contrast is too strong. So this one is actually not bad. It's kind of like the inverse now, which is also very interesting. It feels like the inverse. So I played around with it a lot more. There's a little jump here, but so I decided to go back and change a little bit the graphic breakup. I added the front. I made it grayish. I made it into the secondary color rather than the front color, just to have this like bigger part here that is chopped off, and have a bit less of the orange and a bit more of the secondary color. So I just went back into Modo, changed a bit of selected a few more polygons up front, and like you saw in the first video, and I made some adjustments that I thought were kind of at the bottom of the problem that I had, where you see that's kind of I took a step back, and that's how I decided to solve it. Also for that secondary color, now that it has actually a lot more space, that it takes up a lot more space, I want to be a bit more careful with it. So I just copy and paste the entire assembly for the orange color and bring it into, and plug it into the secondary color. And however, I want to have it kind of grayish, so I'm gonna completely desaturate it and use a grayish color for that. So I'm basically gonna use the initial shader as kind of like a jumping off point. So I have basically everything already there, and it looks a bit more cohesive, and I can go in and change a lot of the, I can flip around the colors. So now the result looks a lot better than before. I have this kind of uniform color, but I still have the texture, the kind of graphic layout subtly hinted at in the orange part, and I kind of like the more grungy part in front. See if we can have different kinds of reflections in the front part. Maybe it's a tad too dark. Maybe I want to get it a bit lighter in comparison to the dark crevices, the mechanical parts, the engine parts below that are kind of peeking out. You know, it's still time to experiment right until the last minute. So what I want to take care of is that these lines on the front part in the gray area don't look too dark. They don't have too much contrast. I think it looks nicer if the contrast is kind of there, but a lot more subtle like it is now. So I was playing around with the contrast just to get it just right. If it's too contrasty, it just doesn't look too nice. It kind of fights against the illusion of scale that we're trying to achieve here, that the ship is rather big. So I want to keep those surface color contrast and value contrast to a minimum. So you see that before the viewport refresh was quite snappy. Now it has become a bit slower, because of course once you load in lots of different materials, a lot of different big texture files, you have like texture emissions, things will slow down a lot more. And of course rendering it out at a higher resolution will take longer and longer then. Playing around with the tiling a bit more, maybe we can achieve a different result here. A nicer breakup of shapes, nicer indication of scale and detail. Maybe we can have some secondary reflective kind of details that could indicate some sort of substructure. Let's copy paste that and see if we can have a more controlled mix of my materials. Maybe something with a bit of dirt. So now I want to control how it's mixed. Maybe it's a bit too harsh. I can play with the contrast, the gamma, the power of the texture to achieve a different kind of mixture of things. But ultimately I decide that it's maybe too much contrast. It almost looks like destroyed, and that's not really the look I want to achieve. So let's get rid of it. I work with a very limited set of textures for this, and I think I also work in general with a very limited set of textures, but I'm trying to find different ways of mixing them. So there's a bit of, I think I set the dirt node I have in there a bit too large in scale. I'll need to fix that later. But overall, I think the result is getting into an area which I'm quite happy with. And that only is for the ship itself. We haven't even started playing with the environment. So that will increase the quality of the look even further. Again, I'm just playing around with the same kind of things as before, the scale of the textures, to get the right scale for the overall look. You see, there is this kind of like, I plugged in a noise texture to add a bit of noise overall. It's a bit too large in scale, it looks a bit too grainy, so I need to adjust that, and I will do so later. Because even though I say like this is maybe about texturing, but that doesn't mean the texturing is done at the end of this tutorial, end of this video, because we have to go in later as well and make adjustments as we go. Maybe while we adjust our environment, we realize that certain things on the ship are not working, so we should definitely go back and make more adjustments to the textures of the ship itself, to the materials. So the job should never be considered done until you send it off to the client. And I mean, mostly even then the job is not done, but it's just that we don't have any more time to refine it. So the scale now that overall might be okay, but actually on down at the cockpit area, wherever our bridge is, it doesn't quite look right. So we actually need to adjust it further down a bit. So we'll make it even smaller so that the paneling down there at the cockpit area actually makes sense. So we don't usually, I would put like a character there to indicate scale so that it can always understand how big things are supposed to be, and because the scale of the character defines everything, how big the cockpit is, and then how big the metal paneling is, how big certain details are supposed to be. So, but of course here in space we're not going to have like some dude standing around. We can have maybe an astronaut floating in space or whatever, but short of that, we kind of need to see, like, based on the cockpit, maybe how big things could be. So I think the paneling looks quite okay now. We'll fix a few other things later on. So it's always nice to look at your design from all angles to make sure that it all looks proper. Just quickly changing the altitude to even higher, so I have it up to 1 million. I'm actually going to go in and I want to go to my planetary environment slowly, and I want to get into loading some textures into my planetary environment. The nice thing is that you can actually load some planet textures and star maps into the planetary environment. It has all slots for that, inputs, so which makes it a lot easier. So now I can load like a star field into the background slot just by using an image and adjusting the scale of it, and I'm gonna have a very nice field. And even if you have some good images with like nebulas in there, you have even like a little nebula in the background. And you can do the same for the planets. So for the planet down below, you can plug in planet textures if you have those. You have even multiple different slots for reflectivity and illumination. And it's not, I wouldn't call it like the be all end all. I think it's a good start, and it can give you some nice angles and things. But if for a full finished painting, I think, and if you want to have a large chunk of the frame be the planeted surface, then you definitely need to go back in there and play with the quality of the photographic images. So now you even have in the planetary environment a sun setting to adjust the sun position, so the planet down there will be in shadow a bit more. But we'll play around with that in the next video a lot more. So see you in the next one then. Okay, so the break from the other video was a bit harsh, but here we are back in Octane, or still in Octane, and now we want to play with the environment. So like you've seen before, we were playing with the planetary environment. So, and now I'm playing also with the post-processing features. So I click on the button all the way in the top right corner, and I can play with the bloom power, with the glare ray amount, with the glare blur to achieve a result that I kind of would like. So I dialed also the environment power down to have it a bit darker and have the artificial illumination of the ship a bit stronger. So you see that once you play with the bloom, you have to be very careful, because once you have a light source directly in the image, it will really blow everything out. And then also the illumination on the ship itself will be immediately so much stronger. So you need to be really careful with this kind of stuff. While it can add a nice touch to your image, like the reflections of the sun on the ship get this light blooming, which is really nice. But of course, it can immediately destroy your image. So we need to play with the sun position, the sun size, the amount of bloom that we want to have, with the emission power of our artificial lights. The initial reaction for me is like to really turn up the bloom, but then at the same time also turning it down again once you realize what you have done. I was also going to experiment a bit with the medium. The medium allows us to have like a uniform kind of environment fog. Of course, kind of nonsense to have environment fog in space. That kind of destroys the idea. But who knows, right? Maybe we can get some really nice effects with that, right? Maybe we'll end up in a very different kind of scenario, maybe inside a nebula, right? We do not need to stick to having only one kind of environment. We can, with a single setup, create a variety of different scenarios so that we have maybe a very clear looking space image like the one you can know from NASA and like Earth orbit, or we have something more out there with like colorful nebula engulfing our ship that also maybe are illuminated and give our ship a bit of different feeling. So the medium settings is basically a combination of the color of absorption and scattering and a mixture of the medium radius and the density factor. Playing around with those, and depending on the scale of your image, you will end up with this very uniform looking fog. It can give very nice results if you have objects that are very close to your camera compared to objects that are further away. But of course, for this kind of space image, it is not necessarily that useful. So I got rid of it. Same as you can imagine, like a nebula is like a localized phenomenon in space. The same way we should treat that in Octane, but we'll get to that later. Now you can see how the artificial lights on the ship are playing with the reflectiveness of the surface. And now I actually, like I said before, I want to go in and maybe adjust some of the materials now that I see how it really behaves. So I'll copy and paste one of my textures into the this kind of dark material I have on the bottom of my ship, which gives me like this kind of tiling. I already have this kind of setup in my previous texture, so I might as well just use it again by just copy and pasting it. I'm adding a slight color correction and basically inverting it and plugging it into the specular channel, which is just maybe a bit overdoing it. I don't want to have it like a mirror or like a really wet looking surface. I just want to have like a little bit. Now I'm copy pasting it and adding a different texture, maybe some kind of grunge, dirt, scratches. And maybe I need to also dial that down a lot. And I always want to rotate to see how it behaves in in reaction to a light source. Only then I can really accurately judge how it really behaves. So I'm adding this kind of like cell substructure kind of thing. If I make it really tiny and make it very almost invisible, I think it could add like a very nice touch to it. It might be barely visible in most instances, but I think in some angles it just might like add that little bit of extra attention to detail. I'm copy and pasting the same ones into some of the other materials. Again, it just adds like a tiny bit. But in case I want to have any close-ups, I think it's going to be very useful. Of course, up close you also see areas that are quite unfinished and not so good looking, but we're not going to see the ship from every angle really up close, so we can get away with some level of it looking unfinished. It's looking quite neat. There's our planet. It's kind of darkish, like evening on that side of the planet. So I'm just kind of trying to get a feel for like maybe some angles we can shoot. Once we're happy with everything, with the setup of our ship, with the setup of our environment. There's also the imager, which is kind of additional way to get like some in-camera effects. So like vignetting, maybe a certain kind of like film emulation that you want to use. We can play with the exposure. All things, of course, you can do in Photoshop as well, but I kind of like to play with it right in Octane, because sometimes it gives me like interesting results that maybe I wouldn't have done that same way in Photoshop. So I'm thinking that I'm getting a slightly different end result and a better end result than otherwise. But that is really up to every person's preference. Also, the settings are really up to every person's preference. The only thing I would say is don't overdo it, because if you destroy the image too much, if you make it too harsh, if you make it too contrasty, you lose all the details and you cannot recover those later in Photoshop. So falling short of a complete like flat color profile, but I like to do it this way. Trying to see it from different angles, trying to see if there's anything I can improve, I can do better. Getting inspired by my own creation, so to speak, figuring out different angles of what could look cool, rediscovering my own design, so to speak, because now that it's very dark, only partially it's lit, you have all the materials applied and the lights on and everything, you find different angles that are working well, that are not working so well, then rather than or compared to what you had before. And I think that's an important part in not getting too bored with your own design, and still having fun at the end of a project when it's only about finishing and delivering finished frames. Having that big sun in there is great, but then suddenly you don't see the ship anymore. That's not good. So you see also how once we see the planet in frame and having the bloom activated, it really is like an overwhelmingly powerful soft bloom layer on top of everything. I want to play with the aspect ratio, trying to see which one would look best. 3:1, or maybe something more square looking. That is really up to you as well. There's no right or wrong. You can go for something more cinematic. You can go for square Instagram. You can go for anything you like. Whatever aesthetic you prefer. 4:3. You can play with the altitude even more, put it up to 2 million, and then we'll even set further into space. And the planet below us is getting smaller and smaller. So this kind of new planetary setup is very useful. And like I said before, not the be-all, end-all in terms of quality, but I think it can get you to where you want to go a lot faster than if you would do it manually. Okay, so I turned up the daylight again, made it a bit brighter, the power of the environment, so it's not all so dark. I just plugged in one of my textures into the bump map channel to get an additional kind of level of detail on there. So you see I just plugged in the same image I had before into the bump channel. And that's about all. There's still some refinement I need to do on some of these textures. Some of them just don't look good. To just find which texture controls what. See here, there's like this dirt texture which kind of doesn't work so well on there. I think mostly it's that the dirt doesn't look to scale. So maybe let's try something different. So I just made it look a slightly bit different so it looks better. Now having an overall look over our surface here, I think it's working quite well. Maybe some areas here and there need a slight touch-up, an additional level of detail. It's like barely visible, but still should spend some time on dialing it in correctly. Zooming in, going from piece to piece to really see that everything looks good. Again, zooming, rotating, seeing how the light reflects off it. Very important part that you always need to do constantly to see if everything works well. And also to figure out the best angles from which to show your design. A good design can be destroyed by very bad lighting, very flat lighting. Lighting should show the materials, should show the form, should make everything understandable right away. So let's have a look at maybe we can plug in some different channels into the globe. Any additional levels of detail, bumps. I happen to have some maps here, different kind of maps for the Earth. Let's see if some of these have any effect. So let's see which of these will work well. Let's play around with it a little bit. Can even use the night map as the main albedo map, and we can see it creates all these lights down there. Depending on whatever planetary textures you have, you can use Jupiter, you can use Saturn, or whatever made up one you want. You can play with the scale. Depending on the frame that you have, you can rotate, scale the nicest looking surface on the planet below you want to have. Doesn't matter if it's accurate or if you have to play with a scale of it. I think it's best to get the optimal result for the shot you want to do. And this looks quite cool. You get a really interesting parallax, and you can really choose the best graphical composition that you want to achieve. Of course, if you have to be completely scientifically accurate, then you can't do that, but for us here, we don't care. We can do whatever looks best. So we can actually overlay different kinds of maps that don't match with each other in different scales to get different kinds of results. So you can see how we can rotate the normal map, scale the normal map over the different looking albedo texture, and to get very different results. Even have a cloud map. So you should try to find some good textures to play around with. These are a lot of fun. You can see now we have like clouds on the surface here, which is very cool. Clouds on top of a water planet kind of thing. Because why not? Now this kind of works. Now we have some landmass and some clouds. Okay, so our surface looks quite neat now. I think that might be quite good. Still playing with some stuff. So you can see you can plug in, you can mix the textures, you can do pretty much everything like you can with the different with the materials themselves. You can make some nice planet textures, or you can leave it pretty realistic, however you want to. Again, for a final illustration, I probably want to change it in a paint over, use higher resolution images, or exactly the kind of location I want to see down there. If the Earth down there features very prominently in your illustration. If it's just kind of like a background and the main thing is on the ship, I think it's more than fine, because the focus should be, after all, on the ship itself. Again, checking everything from all sides. There's that bloom again. Maybe a tad too strong. Or not strong enough. Depends on you. Nuclear sun. So that's something I wanted to do here. I plugged in a noise texture into the brightness spot in the color correction to kind of get a very even distributed surface. But you can also go to plug in a dirt texture and make your ship really dirty. So we can play a bit with the different kind of settings that we have here and see what kind of blending we can get. So I plugged it into the brightness because I kind of want to play with the overall brightness of that dirt layer. So I can have the dirt there, more dirty or less dirty. I don't like the strong contrast, like I said before, and from the yellow to the black. I don't want to have that everywhere or very prominently featured. It's kind of neat that it's only a bit on the top here with this dirt node and kind of disappearing towards the end. So I had like a previous dirt texture which I experimented around with, so I mean, it looks very similar. You can kind of see that it kind of gives this idea of like a very used ship, like the paint is kind of like peeled off overall and has been abused and banged up. So plugging that dirt node in there is giving me the right result I want. And you can experiment, you can plug it into different inputs and play around with it. Maybe we can use it here as well. See if it does anything. You can control a bit the unevenness in the surface. I'm using my surface texture as well in the bump channel, so that gives me the right result I want. Some parts are reflective, some are not. Some are bumpy, some are not. That's the right kind of level of detail I want. Going a bit more up close with the textures to see if everything works well. I kind of like that paint job up there. It's not too sharp, it's not too blurry, just right. So it makes sense that it has been maybe painted once and now over time it's just been corroded and abused and peeled off. There's some other accidental parts in there that I never intended to be there, but they look quite nice. Engines are fine. I think we're not gonna see any like crazy details on top of there. We're not gonna have any, I think, prominently featured shots with the detail, with the engine detail. So I kind of can leave them as it is. The engines are kind of generic, so I don't want to feature them too prominently. It's more about the design of the ship itself. Okay, so now we've done that. Let's have a look at actually adding some kind of localized areas of fog and nebula. For that, I need to add a new geometry group so I can have multiple objects like I showed you before. Add some inputs in case I want to have more pieces of fog. So I'll plug my ship in the first slot of the geometry group, and I already have some prepared that I played with before, but of course I'm going to show you how to do it from scratch. So we'll add a placement node so we can move our fog around and scale it and rotate it. And then we'll add geometry volume. So it will ask us to open a VDB file. I've included some for you here to play with. One is courtesy of Mitch Myers, so thank him for that. The other one is from OpenVDB, you can download. So you see that there's a little like plume of smoke here that's kind of standing in the center of our geometry here. And of course we want to move it a bit away and make it bigger and make it also colorful. So I'm going to my placement node and make it a lot larger. So you see that there's like the ship is partially obscured here. That is just because the fog right now is very black. So I can give it a different color. And you see it appears here. But it looks very much like smoke. It's very thick. So I want to make it a bit more vaporous. So I can change the volume step length to something a lot higher and make the density a lot lower. And so you see now that we have something that is much more looking like some sort of foggy nebula kind of thing. It still looks a bit too much like an actual piece of smoke because that's really what it is. But I think if we stretch it a bit and only look at it from certain angles, I think it's actually doing its job quite well. So you can play endlessly with the two options you have here, the scattering and the absorption colors, to arrive at exactly the kind of mix of things you'd like. So it gets like a little bit of a red hue there. We can also play with the emission, which we will do in a second. So now I want to do stretch it in the y direction, so I get this kind of banding. A very horizontally stretched kind of fog. But whatever looks best, right? So it doesn't really look like smoke to me in this section. So now we can play with the emission. I changed the emission from no to texture emission, and now I can actually play with, I can have it glow in partially. So you see we're getting almost like setting the emission to something greenish, turquoise. We're getting something almost looking like in the feeling of like a northern lights kind of phenomenon, which is really quite interesting here. And it goes well with the color contrast of our ship, which is very yellowish orangey at the moment. So that contrast is working well. So you have a lot of different things to play with in your emission. You can put in a color ramp, which we will do later, to get different results again. There's a lot of things to play with, and I encourage you to just try it out and see what kind of results you come up with. Of course, you have to note that once you add in these kind of fog volumes, your render times will really go down. So it will take a lot longer to render these kind of things. And you have to be aware of that, especially considering that you have some final renders to do that will be a lot larger in resolution. So now I'm seeing what kind of angles we can do. Even with this like really simple setup, I think we can get some really interesting results. Of course, you can do this stuff later in Photoshop as well, but as you'll see as you can kind of see already, is that the the ship's material is kind of interacting with the glow of the nebula, of our fog. So that's something very interesting we want to play with. So there's also a ramp where you can even fine-tune your fog volume even more. You can add a variety of different kinds of points here. You can add different kinds of points and have an even more distinct looking fog volume to exactly the specifications you want to have. You can have a rainbow or whatever you want. So we're getting some quite nice results here with that simple VDB you got online for free. So now I can move my volume around a bit, place it exactly where I want it to be. So it really looks like the ship is flying through the nebula, which is exactly what I want to. So like partially it obscures it in front, so it really gets the feeling of we're like in the middle of some kind of thick cloud of whatever, which can help to liven up the otherwise very empty, like the usual space images, to get a very different look. If we're not necessarily after the very clear, like NASA kind of looking images. Depends on what kind of style you want. So the same way that I have loaded in this other VDB file, you can add multiple and layer them on top of each other to achieve even more unique looks and more complex looking, well, in this case, like nebulas or other kind of phenomena. So you have another fog stretched, kind of to give a bit of a directional movement. You can almost like probably simulate being like in some kind of like warp or like, how do you say, like, some kind of light speed kind of effect you can achieve with this kind of stuff. It's probably going to look very cool. You can really see how it affects the performance. So we got to be very careful with that. Maybe this kind of nebula is not the one I want to add for this one. So I have some other ones that are a bit more abstract and really look like were intended to look like more like nebula. So one of these is also packaged here, and you can play around with it. So this one I set very big. It's a very it's a big piece of nebula that is actually blocking a lot of the light, which gives again a very different look to the image. So you see I have like a different kind of ramp in here. So I see we can now overlay these two different looking nebulas, and you can see that I kind of it is a very strong looking nebula that even colors the entire area. Well, when you look through it, basically you're like inside of it, and when you look through it, you can see how it changes the entire environment around you. The planet will suddenly appear green. So it gives you, even with the addition of this one, a completely different look to everything without really having to change the planet surface or anything. So by just activating this VDB and diving kind of inside of it, you can achieve a very different look. I even have another one that is really going to bring my GPU to its knees. It's again another massive high resolution VDB that also has some emission to it, so you can see how it has this reddish glow to it in the background. So now I have like 3 VDBs stacked on top of each other to achieve an even more even funkier look to it. So for your final renders, this might really take a long time to properly resolve. Otherwise it will be quite blocky. You can see here a bit how it really looks like from further away. Of course, this will only work from certain angles best. It will get the right look to it. But I think you can create some really, really interesting results by adding a lot of these and figuring out the best kind of combination of these objects. So now I added a placement node into my ship, so I have a bit more control over where I want to place my ship. I'm already thinking what kind of shots I can do, what kind of angles that will look the best, that not only show the ship itself, but also give me a nice view of different kinds of the environment. Now I can go back and play again with my post-processing and checking the kind of blooming and glares I want to have. Now that a lot of the light is being blocked by the VDB, of course I need to change those values. I can dial up the intensity of my artificial lights on my ship so that they get a proper read through all this thick fog. Always need to wait now a little bit to actually get some of the artifacts and grain resolved to take a proper look. You also can look into changing some of our parameters. I'm still under direct lighting, so I probably want to change that to something like path tracing to get a better looking result. It is going to take a lot longer to resolve, but I think the final result is going to look better. So you can see that it actually changes the look somewhat, but it will look more refined at the end of it. But of course, it will take a lot longer. So you need to find the exact mix of parameters that will allow you to render out the frames in the required resolution in the time frame that you have given, right? Even though path tracing might look better, you have to check if it's worth in the end, if you can render out all the frames at the end of the day before you have to hand it to your client. I think that should be the determining factor, and not necessarily what can produce the cleanest render. Because if you can only get one frame done in the time given, then but you're supposed to deliver 5, then that's not going to work. Or you need to find different ways of optimizing your scene, maybe reducing a nebula and painting one in Photoshop, which will be a lot faster. So you need to figure out a mix of parameters and a good ratio between speed to quality that you're happy with. So I disconnected one of the VDB files, to get a quicker rendering result. Now I want to add a few passes that will help me to composite my image in Photoshop more easily. So I have activated the reflection, the volume, and the material ID. All these will help me to control. The reflection will help me to control the reflective amount of my materials, to increase it or decrease it where I see fit. The volume will give me just the volume pass, and I can add or mix my volumes more accurately and more distinctively in Photoshop. And the material ID pass is for me to isolate the object from its background, and also to select certain parts on my ship should I need it. I might not need it for every single image, but it's always good to have. So now that I have all these different pieces, I choose the required resolution and save out all these passes separately. I just use 8-bit images. You can also use 16-bit if you feel like you need more control and you need a wider range of tones. But for me, usually 8-bit was always more than sufficient. If you choose 16-bit, the quality will be better, especially if it's for print and things like that. And if you want to push it a lot harder in your Photoshop edit, but you also need to be careful that the file size will increase dramatically. So now we can go around and with our camera and take a lot of different kinds of shots. Like we usually do, we play with the angle, we play with the fog volumes, we play with the focal length of our camera to composite, to compose a few really nice shots with different kinds of nebulas, with different kinds of looks. So we have some close-ups of the ship itself that shows really nicely the material, maybe a very clear shot of the ship without any nebulas. And also just to show a bit of the density of the entire region here with the fog enabled and the ship cruising through it. So that's really up to you. However you want to compose that. I mean, the whole composing thing of the shots is not part of this tutorial, but I've mentioned it many times before. So there it really helps to dive deeper into the knowledge of camera and have some good reference that will help you to see what's the best shot and how to compose your images. I usually take around maybe anywhere from 8 to like a dozen different shots. And you've probably seen some in the teaser images that I've posted online. I'm trying to get a variety of different looks that show my ship from the best possible angles, so that I can see maybe the front, the back detail further away. I can see all the lighting, the overall silhouette, the silhouette in front, and maybe for the clearer shots also choosing a nice sun angle that shows the ship in a favorable way, and also gives information about the overall 3D shape of it. By choosing the sun angle at the best possible way, so that I can clearly understand from the first look at it how the 3D shape looks like. So once I've done all of these renders and saved out all my passes, I will jump into Photoshop to do a last bit of touch-up. So now we're here in Photoshop. I've brought in all the different passes of all the different shots I did. I did 11 altogether. And like I said before, I have the volume pass, reflection pass, and material ID, which I will put together, organize it into folders. So usually what I do is I take the reflection pass and set it on screen, lower the opacity, and get rid of the areas with the mask that I don't want to have appear in my image. So the reflection pass kind of helps me to dial up the contrast and dial up some of the reflective details in the image here. You can see turning it on and off. You can see how it helps me to give focus on some areas rather than others. So you see here turning it on and off does have an effect. So it's the volume pass. And see how if that can be useful. You see this image has a lot of volumes, so the final render is quite grainy, which I actually quite like sometimes in my images to have a bit of grain, because it I think adds maybe to like the cinematic effect, and also when the renders are too clean, it's not always nice. So now I'm also checking if I can have the volume appear in certain areas rather than others, using a mask again, and getting rid of the parts that I don't want to have appear. So I'm getting rid of those with the gradient tool. And the grain, I think, also helps a bit in giving a bit of texture to the fog. I don't want it to look too much like it's some kind of like soft brush or gradient tool look to it. So when it has a bit of grain, it feels like it's a bit more alive. It has some particles. It has some organic feeling to it. So having the material ID pass allows me to select everything except for the ship, and of course different areas in the ship. So I can work on how the ship reads against the background, can make sure that I can see the silhouette, or I cannot see it wherever I prefer it to be obscured. Maybe I want to add some additional blooming from some other light source further away. You can experiment with that. Trying to make some bolder moves in the beginning. I'll bring in a variety of textures for that are good for like post-processing. Any kind of like lights, additional lights I want to use, any kind of atmospherics, light effects, any sort of stuff that will help give some VFX to the scene and add more life to it. Checking what could be useful. I also will use a variety of photo filters, color lookup tables, to add a different kind of look, or experiment with a different kind of color scheme, different values, a different look to it, maybe some photographic film emulation, just to overall give a more unified look to the image. And maybe also something that I can apply across a variety of images, so that they're also going to look a bit more like a set of images that are closer together in terms of style. So I'm experimenting with a variety of them, layering them, lowering the opacity, because I usually think that any one of them at 100% is way too strong, and can also ruin ruin the overall distribution of values. So I need to see what works. I also use like color balance. I also use things like, of course, a final levels adjustment. The stacking of these will make a difference, so feel free to play around with that. Also play with the vibrance, just to give it a little bit more of a kick. Vibrance is kind of like a more subtle saturation adjustment, to give the images a bit more pop, give the colors a bit more pop. So you do see that there's slight variations in how you stack them that will give you slightly different results. So it's worth, I think, playing around with it. For any kind of fog that I want to add to my scene, I usually go on a screen or lighten layer, and get rid of everything but the fog with a soft eraser. I don't know if the very smoky looking thing is going to be useful here. Maybe in a very subtle way. The main thing I'm trying to achieve, and you'll see that when I drop in more images, is that I want to try to give some kind of organic quality to that nebula, whether it be like particles, some sort of texture, something that makes it look a bit more alive, and in some cases also a bit of directionality, so I can kind of have a bit of like simulate a bit of movement of the ship coming out of a fog, or creating a bit of parallax. I want to avoid adding the typical like engine glow. It's usually pretty easy, like a pretty generic thing to add, but what if we actually not have that typical sci-fi trope, and still want to emphasize movement? Okay, so maybe I want to place some additional lights here on the ship itself or in the distance, maybe indicating some kind of, I don't know, like a space station, another ship in the background, or just like another different kind of light array at the front of the ship, to give it a bit of variation, interest. So you can achieve a lot with these kind of indications, whether you want to leave it deliberately mysterious by having these lights in the background, or if you want to have it more directly placed in the front of the ship to indicate additional artificial lights. There's a lot of options you have. That was quite interesting. Maybe it's a bit too orangey, so I could change the color, for example. Now do the same. I switch the blending mode to screen, so I get rid of all the dark parts. This could be interesting as an additional part to define the back areas. I've never intended it in my model, but it looks quite cool. It's interesting because the front is a bit more defined. It has more geometry definition. In the back, it's deliberately only like a silhouette. But adding these lights can kind of give us a hint of what's in the back, what could the underside in the back of the ship could look like. And then, for example, if maybe the art director likes this, then you can add these later on in the model in a more final version of the ship. Because even though we're kind of done here with the modeling process, I mean, the design is really never truly done until its purpose has been fulfilled as a model in a ship, or as a, I don't know, some kind of collectible model, or depends on what we designed this for. Maybe also it will influence our decision if we go on later to make an illustration of this one, maybe in a landed configuration. So now I'm going in and putting a star field in the back. I felt like the left side in the back, where there should be some stars visible, is a bit too dark. Maybe in that part of the render the star field was not very visible. So I'll just bring it back in Photoshop. Again, I do a mask. I get rid of the parts with the gradient tool in black that I don't want. I disconnect the connection between the mask and the image itself, so I can freely move the image without affecting the location of the mask. Not sure if I want to have that Milky Way so prominently featured in the back. Taking a look at what else I could throw into the image that could give me nice additional areas of detail, VFX, lights, or anything that could improve that image. I think on the right side there could be still some area of improvement. You should always take a minute to contemplate your next move, see how it can be improved. So I brought in a couple of additional images. Again, you see different light effects. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to use them all in this image, but I have a couple of other images here that I'm potentially dropping these in. You'll be able to have access to the PSD with all the images, so you can take them all apart and see where I added some effects and where I thought they fit best. Maybe adding some kind of nice nebula far in the background. Very subtly peeking out of that northern light kind of thing I made. Those really bright stars are kind of distracting, so I want to get rid of them. I don't want it to call too much attention to itself because the focus should be in the ship. This is a very cool image of, I think, a disease where a person has multiple pupils. But I mean, mixing it in this kind of environment kind of creates an additional interesting backdrop, some kind of nebula, and now it really doesn't look like a human eye anymore. Having it very subtly in the background. There's a picture of some embers and sparks I purchased. Could be very nice additional VFX. I don't intend to use it as sparks and embers, but kind of as, I don't know, particles, debris, something that we can indicate speed with, movement. Again, maybe not that fitting in this image, but we will definitely find some use for this. I'll drop it into another folder, so I'll get rid of it for now. What I like to do is for some of the nebula stuff to add bits and pieces and imagery of maybe some kind of fluid simulations, or photography of mixing different kinds of fluids, oils and water and paint and all sorts of stuff. I think it creates quite a nice different level of tactility, of something organic into space imagery, and make it not very explicit but kind of vague, faint, mixing it with more natural looking kind of nebula stuff that we kind of know from science fiction movies or video games or whatever. There's like little things here and there just to spice up, to give a additional level of texture to it, and even maybe some nice colors. Always checking on and off if it actually improves the image. If it doesn't seem to fit, get rid of it. Some interesting light effects. Of course, I'm going to get rid of the hand. I don't need that there. But this kind of abstract shadow that is being cast between the fingers is really quite interesting. Maybe it could be some kind of like searchlights, tractor beam, I don't know. But these kind of effects can come from the unlikeliest of sources. The main thing I was looking for in that image is the contrast, the intensity of the lights, the kind of angle, and the kind of overall idea, inspiration it can give you. That's a very cool image of some sort of fluid mixture experimentation mixed with some kind of space nebula. It almost looks like tiny bits of debris from, I don't know, an explosion, asteroid belt, something a lot denser, particles, grain, all the good things. So I'll add some additional flares, maybe some highlight at the front of the ship, again, searchlights, some kind of brighter spot, mainly to catch our attention and to direct the focus onto the right area. Can be stronger, can be less strong, depending on what you prefer. There's some great photography packs out there that really only cover like light flares, like real captured light flares, and not ones that are generated through some kind of app. I think they look a lot nicer, and they get a lot more interesting camera in lens real effects. So that's why they're quite nice to use, and definitely they're even very cheap, so you can't even talk of investment. That is very cheap and super useful for all this kind of stuff. I'll play around a bit with the color corrections, the saturation, the hue, the intensity, just to get it exactly to that point where it's nice to look at, not too distracting. Trying out different areas. But I think it looks the best in front. And of course, you can always overdo it with the flares, so gotta be careful. All these light aberrations and different photographic effects. I like them a lot, so it's very easy to totally overdo it. You gotta pace yourself. So here's another image where I just dropped a lot of the overlays in that I didn't use in the previous image. So I think these ember streaks that I made will maybe work quite well here in this kind of like top-down 3/4 shot. So adding a bit of these streaky lights, using our mask to maybe drop them behind the ship. Doing some color correction on it. So it helps a bit of to give the feeling of like parallax and speed, movement, adding something additional in there. So we can do something similar with that. As usual, I set it to screen, get rid of the parts, increase the contrast to get rid of the black parts. Now I can stretch it and put it into perspective to see if these additional light streaks will be interesting to add. Maybe it's a bit too strong. These really bright highlights are kind of detracting from looking at the ship itself, which is not what I want to do. So get rid of the really bright parts. Maybe I can have some of these streaks on the side. Even if it's just very subtle. So a good thing I didn't delete these layers before when I didn't find them useful. They definitely have some use now. And dropping them in somewhere else. I'm sure I'm going to find some use for them. I just want to add enough so the point gets across. I don't want to overdo these images necessarily. So this is an image where I probably want to not only work on adding some post effects, but also maybe go in a little bit with my paintbrush and just rough up some areas and touch on some areas here and there that I couldn't really address in 3D, or it would have been too much effort and the time given to make little pieces here and there roughed up and add that kind of localized detail. So basically, I just duplicated my layer stack of color corrections, just duplicate it. And now I can go in with my paintbrush and I don't know, increase contrast here and there, add little scratches, add little details that I didn't get to address before. You can even do this, and then if you want to work up the ship more, and of course you can add an endless amount of detail. You can go in, paint some areas, get new design inspiration, push it further with a couple of strokes, and then go back into 3D and just repeat the process that we've been doing for part 1 and part 2 of this tutorial. So you can go back and model some more areas based on the sketch you did. And improve your model further and further in 3D if you wish to do so. I took mostly care of the overall design of the ship. There's still a lot of areas which can definitely be improved and worked on and added detail. But it's pretty much the same process that I have shown you so far. At some point, it makes more sense to improve your model on a per shot basis, and not necessarily all around. Otherwise, you will spend days and days on modeling stuff on areas you'll never be able to see. You'll never see in any of your shots. And at least for a concept workflow, that is often time wasted. Of course, if you're building a model that is maybe going to be used in a movie or going to be used in a video game, especially in video games, you have to be able to see all the details from all angles. So if you're actually working on a ship design that will be in game, then you need to really figure out all aspects of the design, all areas, all minute details. But if you're doing it on a per shot basis, and it's purely for concept, then I think it's more efficient if you get it to an overall good state, so that you can take all these shots from various angles. But then maybe later on, it's better to work on a per shot basis to get the work done in time. Because even though we're using 3D and we're doing all this kind of stuff, we still very much work under concept constraints, and we just don't have the time to work up these 3D models to that kind of crazy degree. It's adding little touches here and there, emphasizing some areas. Again, you can paint this up quite a bit. You can add textures the usual way and define more areas. Always keeping in mind that are you doing one image? Are you doing a dozen images? So I'm adding very little subtle stuff here and there. This is kind of the opposite of what I did before with these images in Photoshop, with adding all these effects and stuff. So different images have very different purposes. This is more like straight up frontal shot that should more show the design itself, rather than a lot of the atmosphere. The other images I did before are maybe more like mood images that can show the kind of environment the ship operates in. So I'm just going to repeat this process for all the other images as well. in the PSD you'll be able to check them out and see what I did to each image. But that kind of concludes this part of the tutorial. So I hope you enjoyed this part, and can't wait to see what you guys come up with for your own ships, for your own renders. I hope you learned something from this, and I'll see you on the next one.